Alright, so this video is on how I did the Windstar intake manifold swap on my 2000 V6 Mustang. Now this will work on any 99 through 04 V6 Mustangs, as well as any other V6 Mustangs that have split port heads. Now today I'm just going to be focusing on the Windstar intake from the 96 through 98 Ford Windstar vans with the 3.8 liter. Now there were other Windstar vans that had a 3.0, I believe, which that intake will not work. And there are other intakes off of the 4.2 F-150s and some of the later Ford Windstars that will work, but I don't have any of that information on hand of model years or anything specific like that. So today we're going to be focusing on the Ford Windstar 96 through 98, which is what this intake here is. Now I pulled this one out of a junkyard and it was about 40 bucks, I'd say, which ain't bad, you know. And now the reason people would want to do this swap is because that Ford Windstar has the exact same engine as this Mustang does, except it's in a transverse orientation. But that engine makes 200 horsepower. This only makes 190. And the only difference is that upper intake manifold. So, you know, that's a guaranteed 10 horsepower plus tune, maybe 15 at the most. Now, as far as removing the intake, there's only 12 8mm bolts down there that holds it to the lower intake manifold. So it's not that hard to remove. It's literally just take the old intake off and put this one on. But you do have to sort of modify it quite a bit. So as far as the gasket is concerned, where it mates between the upper and lower intake, you're going to want to use the Ford Windstar rubber O-ring gaskets because they seal a lot better, and since it's a plastic manifold on cast aluminum, it just works better, I guess. Now the one thing that I'd say is probably the most irritating is right here. This little thing that I have my throttle bracket connected to is where the Ford Windstar idle air control valve used to be. Now this used to be a lot higher up. If we get it to focus here. Now this, you can see where it rises up right here. That used to come up probably about an inch tall. And also used to come over here as well because it had the Ford Windstar throttle body, which worked with the idle air control valve, kind of like the way it is on the stock Mustang. Now what you're going to want to do is grind it off, cut it off right here where it's flush, where it sort of comes over, and you're going to have to relocate the idle air control valve, unless you want to reuse the Windstar idle air control valve and throttle body. But you'll have clearance issues with the hood. Now the way I have it set up here is it clears the hood pretty well, but you can see where it was rubbing just a little bit. Did have to grind these bolt heads down just to get it to fit under the hood without rubbing. And now I can't run a hood liner anymore because of that, but luckily I can still run the stock hood. Now, back on to talking about relocating the idle air control valve. This is where I relocated mine to. Now, it's just a simple aluminum bracket with a little bend in it where I can bolt it down. I drilled and tapped 2 holes into this aluminum where I can put in fittings for these hoses. Now it goes in and out of the idle air control valve. Also, I mounted the EGR, one of the EGR solenoid things right here as well. But how I did this is just, I believe 5/8 inch hose, silicone heater hose, which you don't have to make it look like this. I guess sort of aesthetic reasons I did it like that. Some people leave it back there, or where it normally hooks up, but this is the way I did it. And you will have to extend the wire from where it originally come from. But what I did is, if you can see underneath here, there is a brass elbow, in which, I guess you'd say, like right underneath here on the underside of the intake, I drilled a hole and then tapped it for that elbow, and that elbow is the intake side of the IAC. I don't mind all these zip ties. I just have these on here because this likes to collapse a little bit under vacuum. I need to put like a sort of a spring in there that'll keep it from squishing down on itself. But that's the way I did that. And then the idle air, the air coming into the idle air control valve comes in right here from the intake, the cold air intake. Now back onto throttle body choices. Now you can reuse the stock throttle body, I suppose, but you'd have to block off the idle air control valve port on it. Now this is a throttle body it's basically a GT throttle body off of a 4.6. I believe this one might have come off of a Crown Vic or something like that, but it is the exact same intake, or exact same throttle body. Now to get it to work, I did have to machine sort of a angled spacer. I don't know if you can see that fine machining work. How it's angled down is to give the throttle body a little bit of an angle down, because it would hit the hood right here. But it is a GT throttle body, so I guess you will get that extra airflow, which, the way I see it, it's just a supporting mod. It doesn't really give you any horsepower. Yeah, you might get a little bit better throttle response, but I guess it's nice to have. And here's the throttle bracket. This is just a piece of metal that was bent. And then I have a cork gasket under there to keep from getting any kind of vacuum leaks. And this is part of the old throttle bracket, which I just cut off and bolted on. And I did have to shave it off just a little bit on top to keep it from hitting the hood. You will need a GT throttle cable because they hook up a lot different than the V6. You can see it's the, I guess, ball and clevis is what you want to call it. Plus, you'll need the throttle return spring from a GT or a Crown Vic. Moving on to this side, this is my custom Kolpak bracket. It goes onto that bolt hole on the Windstar intake, and it's just a bracket. I don't know how else to describe it. It's threaded on the back, so these bolts will hold in. And on this side, it's only got one bolt down on the bottom where it will bolt into the Windstar intake, which it's pretty sturdy. Like, it's pretty sturdy. Now coming over here, you have two ports, I guess you call them ports, on the Windstar intake. I use this one right here for the brake booster, and this one right here I did have on the Pcv valve, but I decided to relocate it up to here because these cars are notorious for sucking in oil through the Pcv, and I didn't want all that going just directly to this back cylinder. You know, if anything, I want to relocate all that oil, distribute it to all the cylinders, I guess. That'd be a lesser of the worst, I guess. But this is how I did the PCV. Yeah, I know I got zip ties everywhere. I just need to go buy some proper hose clamps, but this is working for the time being. This is where the PCV goes in, and I just got it kind of routed up under the intake manifold coming up here. This is just a 90-degree elbow off of a Pcv valve, actually, and it works. Speaking of vacuum lines, this one right here goes to the HVAC controls inside of the cabin, And this one goes to, I think it's some kind of charcoal filter down in the fender well. Now these two fittings weren't here. I had to drill and tap the intake manifold to put these in. Right, back over here to this side. This little, I guess just my vacuum hose splitter or whatever you want to call it. Vacuum line splitter. This actually came off the Windstar. I just, brought that with me. This here goes to the EGR right somewhere. It goes to one of those EGR lines over there. And this is for the fuel pressure regulator, which you do need. Now I want to touch on, some people like to do the swap and they will delete the Pcv valve. Now what they'll do is they'll just put a little breather, little filter right here, little breather filter right there and right there. But I decided to keep it, Now this is, I guess, the intake for the PCV. Now this is running down through here into the cold air intake on the other side of the mass airflow sensor, because you do want that air to be metered. But I just thought I'd throw it out there how some people like to delete the PCV valve. Also with the EGR, I did have to cut and weld it a little bit right there, if you can see, because I wanted to keep the EGR. I know it's stupid, I guess, to bring in exhaust gases and put them back through the intake, but what it does is it's taking the nitrogen from the exhaust gases and burning that again, which will keep your cylinder temperatures down, which I think is a good thing, because I did have a problem with spark knock before in this car, so I wanted to keep it. Now, in order to keep it, this intake does sit a little bit lower than the stock intake. You have to get the Egr bracket from the Windstar. Now that's why I had to cut and weld it again, or cut and weld the EGR tube to get it to fit, because it sits lower. Some people will delete the EGR, which that's fine too. I guess, do what you want to do. This is what I did, is a lot more work than just deleting it outright. Which, if you're going to get a tune, which I recommend, you can do that, and it won't have any issues with it. Also, if you're going to keep the EGR, you have to relocate the DPFE sensor. And also the wire will have to be extended for that. Now all it is just a sensor. It goes down there to the EGR tube with two rubber hoses. I just drilled and tapped a hole right into the shock mount, I think on both sides. Yep. And I just mounted it there, clean and out of the way. All right, now we're back over here again. Now the fuel rail did have to be bent out of the way a little bit. It did sit more upright, so now it's bent this way. What I did was I just took a pipe wrench, put it on right there, that little squared part, and just slowly, carefully bent it out of the way just a little bit, just so you can get this clearance in between here, between the intake and the fuel regulator. Also, this little bleeder hose, or bleeder valve, or whatever you want to call it, that had to be bent forward just a little bit, and it was cut off about half an inch. Cut about half an inch off of it to get it to work, because you see it's pretty tight. You can tell that this manifold wasn't meant for a Mustang, but we'll make it work. Important that I think is overlooked quite a bit is you will need the bolts from the Windstar. The original bolts that come on the Mustangs are too long. They just, you won't get the full clamping force if you use those bolts. These ones are slightly shorter, and also something very important, if you can see, there's this little black retainer thing that kind of goes into the intake. It's sort of like a kind of a standoff sort of thing. It keeps it from being squished, because it's just plastic that's made of metal, to keep it from just destroying the intake when you tighten down the bolts. And also you won't be able to hold it down if you don't have those. So that's very important. Make sure you get all 12 of the bolts and all 12 of those little retainers wherever you get the intake from. Something I touched on a little bit earlier is extending the wires. Now you will have to extend the throttle position sensor wire because it's, the throttle body used to be here, but it's now here. So you have to extend that wire. Also, yeah, you have to extend the air intake temperature sensor wire. Idle air control valve's wire had to be extended as well. I think lastly is the cold air intake. Now this is the stock Mustang, well stock, but Mustang cold air intake that I had on here originally. Now what I did was I had to get rid of the little plate right here that I guess sort of blocked off the engine compartment from the fender well. But I did have to cut this part off where it sort of bends, where it would come down here and then bend in. I sort of cut it off like right there, and I put my filter on right there. There's still a slight bit of bend at the end of it, so you can see, I hope you can see. And then that comes up to the mass airflow sensor. And then this was the other part that was right here that went right into the throttle body. I did have to trim it a little bit, and it's backwards now. You can see right there, that little spot. That's where it used to rub, I believe, like right here or somewhere, but this is flipped around, and you can see where the little bend is right here. This is where the throttle body used to connect to right here. If it'll focus, please focus. Right here is where the throttle body used to be. So you can see it is turned backwards. I did have to drill and tap that into the cold air intake for the idle air control valve. All right, so going on with the cold air intake. Now this is a 90-degree silicone elbow I ordered off of eBay, the price where everybody gets their go fast parts. And that goes into the GT throttle body. Okay, so I think that is about it in terms of my talking points and everything that I remembered that needs to be modified or just to get this intake to work. Now it is a lot of work. It did take me 3 days, but I would say that it's worth it in the long run. Going down the road, it runs perfectly, has a lot more low-end torque. I'd say it picked up at least 20 to 30 foot-pounds of torque on the low end. It's crazy. It pulls great in overdrive. Yeah, it gives it a lot better drivability. It's almost like a V8. Yeah, I just said that, but I mean in terms of torque, like you don't have to rev it out as much to get up to speed. I'd say probably the best thing about it is the low end torque that it picked up. Now, yeah, it feels like it revs out quicker. Yeah, it probably picked up a little horsepower on the top end, but probably my favorite thing about it is the low end torque, and it just pulls. All right. So if you watched this video, I appreciate you watching. I'm sorry if I sound a little winded. It's cold out here and I'm freezing my ass off. So I appreciate you watching. And if there's anything else you want me to touch on, just hit me up in the comments. I'll try to reply to all the comments. But thanks for watching. All right. So this